Okay, thank you. At this point, I'd like to invite all of our panelists up to the table here in front, if you would mind coming up and taking a seat. And I'm going to introduce two new folks to the table who will be joining them. Tad Stern is a senior consultant with Michael Baker International and task leader on the Carlsbad Local Coastal Program Update. Tad's 25-year career in urban and natural resource planning has involved environmental impact assessment, coastal planning and permitting, general plans, and all aspects of project management. He's been involved with LCP updates in the cities of Monterey, Seaside, and Hermosa Beach, and regularly works on projects involving coastal development permits. Thank you. We also have Brian Leslie and Christopher Webb. Is that right? No, just Brian Leslie, who is a coastal scientist with Moffitt and Nichol, who specializes in coastal planning and engineering, and who's been hired with the city to study the effects of future sea level rise in Carlsbad. Brian is the lead scientist who analyzed the effects of future sea level rise in Carlsbad and who prepared the city's draft sea level rise vulnerability assessment. Thank you for joining us, both of you. So we did get a handful of question cards. And I will start with, the first one might be good for Sarah, or let's see. Can you address sea level rise in San Diego County as it compares with different regions across the U.S. and globally? Is it relatively moderate compared to, say, Florida? Anybody want to take a crack at that?
All right, I'll take a crack at that. That's actually an excellent question. So sea level rise does vary regionally pretty dramatically. In part, that's because of local processes such as whether the land is subsiding or going upward because of tectonic processes. So Florida was brought up. Florida is experiencing more extreme sea level rise in part because Florida itself is actually subsiding. So you have a bunch of different factors that go into what affects sea level rise regionally. It just so happens that in this region, we happen to sort of match the global average. That's sort of coincidental, but that's how it compares to things globally.
Thank you. And just so everybody can hear us, when you are answering, please make sure you're bringing your mics close. We want to make sure everybody can hear you. This is a question maybe for Laura. Can we be confident that major regional projects such as the coastal railroad tracks, I-5 widening, airport upgrades, et cetera, are taking into account impacts of sea level rise?
So that is a great question. I think part of what we're trying to do with this regional project is if we band together as the cities, then we can also get the folks like Caltrans to the table and NCTD, who have also started to come to the table and really understand how they are planning. I know that they do have some policies already in place, but they're also getting guidance from the state that they need to do more. So I don't know how much I could say I'm confident because I don't work for the state anymore. But we are very interested, I know, as a collection of cities in making sure that those folks are at the table. I can say for SDG&E, they have definitely expressed a lot of interest and enthusiasm with working with the cities on their infrastructure. And I do really hope that a lot of the other regional entities like the Caltrans and the train managers also come to the table around this. Any pressure you want to put, and I'm sure will help.
And just to add, you know, I talked about the process basically that we're moving through. The next phase really allows the city to move forward with stakeholders, and we have a series of stakeholder meetings with a lot of those groups that were just mentioned to try to better understand what they are doing for sea level rise and how that overlaps with what their facilities are like within the city limits. So I think there's good opportunity for feedback. Certainly, like with any group of agencies, they all vary as far as how they're handling the issue in sea level rise.
Richard, I think this might be one for you. And it builds on that to some degree. I read recently in the UT that Carlsbad's LCP had already been approved. Can you provide some clarification on where we stand in that process? And from a practical standpoint, what does that mean for individual projects?
Sure. So a very large amount of cities statewide do have local coastal programs, just like City of Carlsbad. But what they're doing is they are moving forward with the amendment process to take into consideration sea level rise. So I mentioned those grants that are being awarded, and it's great. It's almost unprecedented with Coastal Commission issuing so many grants to different cities that are allowing them to do these updates. So that's where we are. We've taken the latest document that the city had for their local coastal program, and it will be updated and then amended to take into account not just sea level rise, but a whole variety of different topics. Tad, I don't know if there's any other additions that you could give as far as the overall update in detail.
Sure. Well, this is really an effort to modernize the existing LCP, and because the city just recently updated their general plan, it's a good time for the city to look at the LCP to make sure there's consistency between the two. You can't have one document with a set of policies and regulations on one hand and be inconsistent with the new general plan. And it's also an opportunity just to update some of the information. Some information in the existing LCP is a little bit dated, and it's an opportunity to update the boundaries, some of the mapping, and incorporate some of the Coastal Commission guidance. The Coastal Commission's very motivated right now for coastal communities to have a certified LCP document, and that's why they're providing all of that help.
Okay, it was noted that FEMA is assessing sea level rise in its flood mapping efforts. The question is whether this work is being coordinated with the USGS Cosmos model, and what is this work going to offer that the Cosmos project doesn't?
Good question. So FEMA is updating their flood maps. I have heard that they could possibly be out this summer. The way I can describe the differences between the USGS and what FEMA is doing is that USGS looks forward. So they essentially say, these are conditions that we might see in the future, so we are going to project and forecast what we might see in the future, whereas FEMA looks at the past. So they look at history and how, sort of defining their 100-year, what's their 100-year flood. So they look historically, but because we've had changes in the past, and especially the most recent past, they're trying to incorporate some of this new science into that. And the hope is, for many of us, that I think their updated science should match somewhat what the USGS has come out. We don't know for sure, but that's what I've heard is that for some of the flood extents, we definitely should see some of the FEMA flood extents growing larger and matching some of the flood extents that the USGS is projecting for the future.
We heard some specific talk about San Elijo Lagoon area and others. Can any of you give us some specific information on the vulnerabilities of lagoons here in Carlsbad, Bad Iquitos, Agua Hedionda, and the Buena Vista Lagoon, and possibly an update on the plan for restoring the Buena Vista Lagoon, if anybody has an update on the status of that as well.
I can start with the vulnerabilities to existing lagoons in Carlsbad are included in the model. Cosmos did an okay job at mapping these hazards. We, Moffett Nickel, expanded those hazards based on what we know about the lagoons. They have variable vulnerabilities, some of which, like Agua Hedionda, has infrastructure, residential areas lining the lagoons. Some of them have more of natural ecosystems. So vulnerability is in something like Bad Iquitos or Buena Vista is more like, is there space for habitats to transition up and back? Whereas Agua Hedionda, there might be some impacts to parcels. I don't have a perfect answer for the Buena Vista Lagoon Restoration Project, except for I know it's ongoing. There's an EIS on the street looking at a number of different restoration options.
Yeah, there's a bit of a process with the restoration work, but what's important to note is we move forward with restoration projects along the coastline. The different agencies, the resource and regulatory agencies that are involved, they do have us look at projecting the restoration work with sea level rise. So when we're looking at wetland restoration and other types of restoration activities where it includes planting and different types of habitats, there is some assumptions that are built in as the sea level rises. So it's not a lost cause or a waste of money to put in a whole bunch of wetlands and then have them be open water in a couple decades.
And can somebody talk to the concept of dredging in the lagoons?
Yeah, so that was actually the piece that I was going to add was, I was just going to expand upon the vulnerability issues. So one of the things to keep in mind is that these systems are all interconnected. So, I mentioned that as the beach is eroding, the estuaries are actually accreting. They're bringing sand into them, and that then impacts the circulation and the ecosystem. And we expect to see more of that happening in the future. So one of the potential mitigation strategies would be dredging. And it becomes something that is actually significantly more complicated because, for example, if you decide to nourish your beach, that nourishment could actually come in and block the mouth of the lagoon. That's part of what happened in Tijuana this year. And so, again, it's these feedback mechanisms. If you do accrete inside of the lagoon and then you have a large precipitation event, suddenly your risk of flooding goes way up because you don't have a mechanism to flush that water out of the lagoon. So that's sort of some of the physical vulnerabilities of these lagoons, which is a combination of the sediment dynamics as well as wave impact and precipitation. And then there are the ecosystem impacts in terms of the fish and the birds that use the lagoon and some of the wetland habitats. And, there's been a lot of work done recently as to whether wetlands can adapt to sea level rise. So, for example, can they actually accrete enough on the wetland portion to keep their plants above water or not? Or is there going to be an inland propagation of the wetland? And that's sort of something that we don't really know the answer to at this stage. So there's a whole different slew of vulnerabilities. Mosquitoes is another one. You trap fresh water in these and you have a big vector control problem as well.
This question, I think, kind of builds on that, and it says, how will biological assessment in the coastal zone be integrated with inland plans and needs to update habitat management plans? Anybody familiar with that?
Well, I just think it's important to note that it's being addressed or at least talked about, and I think that's the key item where several years ago it was not. So recognizing that all of these things that we've talked about cost money, and dredging certainly in beach nourishment, and moving forward, I think the communication is getting better in some cases between the agencies that deal with restoration and habitat. But at the same time, we're also battling that this is kind of a newer science. It's a newer item that we're still learning. And the best thing we can do is continue to share the information. And throughout this entire process, really one thing that's important to note is the monitoring aspect of the strategies that are used or the habitats that are being monitored. Take that information, share it whatever way possible, but then be responsive to the data that you're gathering. And I think it will really go far. There's so many different platforms nowadays, online and just communication techniques to use, where we should be learning quite a bit with all these different projects moving forward.
And a good time to mention, as I said before, we will have city staff available after the panel is complete, and they might be a great resource to test some of those questions with, as well as far as how specific city policies will relate to new information going forward. Okay, this is a pretty specific question, I think. I'm going to see if I can get it off and read it clearly. The I-5 widening project has started, and bridges at Bataquitos Lagoon is to be lengthened and the channel enlarged to the south. The railroad bridge will be replaced and double-tracked, and piers will be replaced to increase total flow velocity. Those plans are well-developed and public, and the question is whether they've been incorporated into the studies that we've done to date or how they will be looked at and incorporated going forward.
I can say that we, Moffett Nickel, worked with Sandag and Caltrans on a study that informed the design of those bridges. So both railroad and I-5 bridges have all accounted for these rates of sea level rise. So we can rest assured with that. We are also looking at those vulnerabilities as potential things to think about. Based on initial assessments and knowing what Caltrans is doing and the low sand corridor, we don't anticipate that being a significant impact, but we will be looking at their plans and talking about that in our report.
Thanks. Okay, can anybody talk to the topic of similar to fire risk mapping, which has led to problems getting and the cost of insurance going up for property owners? Is there anything to be expected along the same lines relative to risks associated with the rise in hazard analysis around sea level?
A question about insurance, it sounds like. Not specifically. What I can say from a very large perspective is that not as much out here on the West Coast, but on the East Coast and the Gulf, where they experience, significant extreme coastal storms and really large damage, insurance companies are changing their policies, and these are companies that are national. So we have yet to see some of those change out here on the West Coast, but there's definitely discussions happening in the insurance world in terms of what makes sense for them and how they might modify some of their rates and their coverage and their policies. But more so, I've seen it on the East Coast and in the Gulf at this point.
And if you just want to think about the wildfire risks, they are also going to be increasing over time as we see this. A lot of it is obviously connected to the precipitation perspective. If we have more droughts and it's drier weather, the one thing that we've seen, and it's in our report as well, is that it's going to be more unpredictable again. You remember last year or 2 years ago, we had fires in May. It's not our fire season. So those are the kinds of things that we expect to happen. We work with a group that helps some of the companies come up with sustainability plans, and one of the things that's starting to come into play is how do we deal with planning for fires, because sometimes you may not think that we're going to be affected directly, but if you can't get to work, if you have to empty a hospital because it's going to be in the fire lanes. And so I don't think we're at the same level as the coastal planning, but it's clearly in the mindset of people to start looking at being much more careful and much more prepared for these changes in wildfires.
Okay. We have a handful of questions that go to specifics about our coastline here and the types of threats and vulnerabilities that we see and what specifically we might do to address bluff erosion or coastal flooding threat or things like that in specific areas and specifically related to public projects and infrastructure improvements that we have planned here in the city of Carlsbad. Given that we're kind of on the front end of understanding the threats here and determining what we're going to do going forward, are there other communities and examples that are maybe a step ahead of us at this point that have developed the policies to effectively deal or the plans to effectively deal with some of the things we see similarly here?
Sort of. There's a few that are up. So, one on the East Coast, there's definitely some interesting projects that are coming out based on Hurricane Sandy. Things like a really innovative project called Redesign, where they're completely rethinking the design of their shoreline and kind of come up with all sorts of new ideas for how to build and what to do with roads and how their community accesses it and emergency centers. So there's those examples, but they are a very different coastal landscape. These are long, broad beaches, and so we are a very different, we have, bluffs. Imperial Beach is probably a little bit of our exception. But with these Coastal Commission grants, there are a few cities that are a little bit ahead of us. So there's a consultant here, Chandra, who worked with the city of Goleta, I mentioned, which is just north Santa Barbara County. They're just wrapping up their work for the Coastal Commission, so we're definitely looking at what the city of Goleta has decided to do. And then, as I mentioned, there's a number of cities in LA, Santa Monica, I think Hermosa Beach might be part of that too. So they're just ahead of us, so we're not the first out the door. Carlsbad's not quite the first out the door. Solana Beach also just has also done some work. In fact, if you're interested, they just released a report on a fee study. So it's basically a study to understand how fees could be assessed to help pay for some of the seawall protection. So it's a report that looks at using the type of property fees to help pay for some of their protection. So there are a few cities that are a little bit ahead of Carlsbad and will be using whatever, I'm sure that the city of Carlsbad will be using whatever it can glean from some of those cities in the process.
Yeah, the nice thing about the regional approach that you're seeing with San Diego is the cities are sharing the information and moving forward in this, holding hands, hopefully learning from each other, because it's kind of an unfounded territory. And what we've seen the most as we process a lot of coastal development permits, both from the development side as well for restoration projects, is the Coastal Commission is providing guidance and bringing up those adaptation techniques on a project-by-project basis. And that's really been the standard for the last couple of years, is as projects come online, that project's responsible for those measures itself. This way that we're approaching it here tonight is much different, where you're looking from a citywide perspective, from a region's perspective, how can we make some of those techniques a little bit more consistent so you do have a consistent coastline where it makes sense. But it is interesting the level of scrutiny and good reason that the Coastal Commission is placing on some of these individual projects. They're already applying that sea level rise guidance, and we need to remember too, whatever adaptation techniques come in line in the future, they need to be pursuant to the Coastal Act, which has fairly hefty guidance on what and what is not allowed.
Thank you. Okay, well, that concludes the time we have available for tonight. So I want to thank you all again for coming out and joining us this evening, and for your engagement on these issues that are so important to the future of our community. I want to remind you all, this forum will be available for viewing on the city's website, as well as all of the presentations that you saw here tonight can be accessed through our website. Please join me once again in a warm thank you for all of our panelists, and have a great night.